I'm Diane Wong, and I'm here in conversation with one of my favorite humans, Tomie Arai, and this is on behalf of Quiet Before. Tomie, I know it's early, but thank you for taking the time to uh, be here. It's always a pleasure to just spend time with you. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, it's really nice to see you this morning, Diane. And I want to thank Nancy Bula Love and the Quiet Before folks for bringing us together. I don't think we've ever had an opportunity to sit down and talk to each other quietly. And I was trying to remember the first time I met you, and it might have been about 7 years ago, or maybe less, maybe 5. Uh, we were both working in Chinatown, and I think I met you in the kitchen behind the store, Wing on Woe on Mott Street, um, to talk about gentrification in Chinatown. Do you remember that? I think May Lum brought us together, and you had just come back from San Francisco doing oral histories with residents in Chinatowns around the country. Um, we were all sitting there at the table thinking about all the changes that had happened in the community.
I can't believe it's been almost 6 years. I think you're right, going on to 7 years now. And we met in the back kitchen of Wow, and May was probably there as well. But at that point, I don't think I was involved with the Art Brigade yet. Um, and so I'm trying to remember what the conversation was like, but I imagine it to have been like 2 hours long.
Yeah, I know, we do go way back, and we've worked together in the Chinatown Art Brigade, and more recently in the Asian Pacific American Voices COVID-19 Archive project, and we're co-curating an exhibition together in 2022. So I feel like our lives are really intersected in so many different ways, and it's just interesting to use this moment to reflect on what brought us together, and I guess what we're thinking at the moment, because
Mm.
I know that this was going to be an interview uh, to talk a little bit about my life journey, and I kind of felt like I woke up this morning thinking, oh no, I don't know what I'm going to say. It's I I feel like it's too soon to be looking back and trying to make sense of everything that I experienced and try to put it together in some kind of narrative. But I do feel like this is a moment when everybody is looking at each other and trying to understand how we got here. So I'm fully ready to talk about uh, whatever it is that sheds some light on that. I know
Yeah,
that.
I really
Go ahead.
was just gonna say in response to thinking about how our lives and work have intersected over the years. Um, it's just been really beautiful building with you and also hearing bits about your story, not just through um, these formal spaces, but also you've been so open about speaking to students, sitting on panels, and so just sitting in the audience, I feel like I've been able to take in different parts of your life through that. But I really appreciate the chance just to be in conversation like this today.
No, I often feel like there's an interest in speaking to people who experience the 70s, people who have lived long enough to claim that they're still standing. And but that doesn't make their story particularly unusual, or even exemplary. So I'm always very curious about why people want to speak to me. But I do think that there were different moments in the Asian American movement that I was privileged to have witnessed or be part of in some small way. And so, you know, I guess the cumulative effect of hearing everybody's voices and spending that time really do lead to a bigger picture. And I know that you're currently putting together a book about the contemporary Asian American movement, and this seems to fall somewhere, you know, in that trajectory. And I was just wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about that as a context for this conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to. And so thank you for entertaining the idea of writing the concluding sort of remarks for the volume, because when Mark Singh Putterman, my co-editor, and I were tasked to think about how to close the book on contemporary Asian American activism, and wanted to look at people closest to me in my life, and someone whose work sort of embodies past, present, and futures as something that is connected. And so thought of you immediately. And the project is something that, you know, I realized after teaching so full-time wise, I'm a professor, right? I teach Asian American studies, American politics. And I realized when I taught my first Asian American politics class, there just aren't a lot of textbooks or resources on the present moment. I feel like so much of a conversation, as you said, has sort of been stuck on the 70s, right? And for really important reasons, because they were so defining in thinking about Asian America as sort of like a political orientation. But I think there's a lot to be lost when we're sort of stuck in a particular moment. And so the work of this project is to really think about more contemporary forms of activism, and specifically work that's unfolding on the East Coast, and from a more diverse group of folks. So we have scholar activists, we have young American scholars, we have artists, archivists, and I think we're just really excited to be able to pull these folks in conversation. And one of the key questions is this question of how does the past connect to how we're thinking about Asian American futures, and specifically the role of cultural work. And hopefully this conversation can sort of be a guiding light for me thinking through some of these questions as well, right? Like, what is Asian American art? And how are we going to memorialize this current moment together?
Yes, I think I shared this story with you that I recently met a very young organizer who was so surprised to hear that there were descendants of Yuri Kochiyama alive and thriving and living today in Oakland in California, and that you could reach out and touch them, you know, and actually involve them in the kinds of organizing you were doing, because they were, as a family, so open to the idea of continuing Yuri's legacy. But you know, they said something to the effect of, you know, it feels like people like Yuri Kochiyama and Gracie Boggs and Malcolm X lived hundreds of years ago, and that there really was that they were fixed in history, and that can't be further from the truth, because I think that, first of all, you know, we're all trying to embody some of that legacy in what we do, but it really is a very young movement, the Asian American movement, and the roots of it, in many narratives, seem to stem from the 70s, but in fact go way back. And of course, you know, we're still struggling to understand and reclaim, you know, a lot of lost history, but it goes back to the very early arrival of Asian immigrants to these shores. And I think there is a lot that needs to be revisited and also maybe even recontextualized. And so something like what you're doing is so important. I know that for me personally, I'm only just beginning to understand as a Japanese American whose family were incarcerated on Native American reservations in the Midwest, that as settlers and as immigrants, we need to acknowledge the land that we eventually found ourselves on, and so that there's very little of that in our narrative, and I think that it is interesting to think now about why there is such an interest in the 70s, and I know certainly those were formative years for me, but they feel like such a small part of a larger story, and very at that time sort of Sinocentric, very focused on West Coast movements, on Chinese, Japanese, and Korean movements, without a lot of attention paid to the diversity within Asians in America and their struggles. And I think we're now just finally taking note of that. And I'm not taking issue at all with the concept of, or construction, of Asian American as an identity. I embraced it as a young person, and I still feel that there's enormous power, and I think importance in that label, if you will. But we certainly need to think past that, and what it means to be a global citizen. But I was, reflecting a little bit this morning when I woke up and trying to think about, how do people tell stories about their lives, and what do they value as a way, to about their lives and that they want to share. And I think that we're all looking for liberation stories. We're looking for stories that are uplifting, and sometimes it's not all that helpful, to have so many questions, about the world and about your place in it. But that has always been something that I've continually asked myself. And I understand, culturally, we all have a hard time talking about ourselves as individuals and how or why we may stand out. And that's certainly not my intention. But I do think that maybe that is part of the overarching theme of my life, is that I've just always questioned like where I belong. So there are moments when I felt totally immersed, in community, and felt totally connected, and other times when that just seems to be out of reach. And COVID certainly didn't help, the last 2 years of isolation, just the big anthropause, that we all experienced, that moment of slowing down. But maybe that's why we're all so invested now in trying to rebuild and ask these important questions. Where are we going? What are we moving towards?
I think it was in that conversation in the back kitchen of WOW where, we sat down, and that was the first time that I learned about your family history, right? And you growing up in Harlem and how you came to grow into yourself as an artist, as identifying as Asian American, as an Asian American artist, as an activist. And I felt like that conversation was just incredibly formative just for me, thinking about, at the time I was trying to finish my dissertation. So, how is it that I'm going to connect this to the communities in which, I write in solidarity with and write with? And I felt like that conversation was really just pivotal for me. And I'm wondering if you could just share about, because it was so powerful, your family history and how, perhaps they came to the US and how maybe your family history has contributed to you becoming an artist, an activist, a mentor, and just all around badass.
Well, thank you. I take that as a compliment, Diane. Yes, I remember sitting in that kitchen and being actually so thrilled to be in one of the, I think, legendary stores in Chinatown, one of the oldest spaces in the community, and having kind of an insider's view of what goes on in that store and being sort of intimately connected to that history and thinking about all the spaces in Chinatown that have meant so much to me that disappeared, and seeing how that was what was bringing us together at that moment. I met my husband in Chinatown. We've been married for almost 50 years, and I think that I can trace the very beginnings of my excitement, in discovering my Asian American identity back to those very early days. The basement workshop. And I would go down to Catherine Street, Chinatown, meet all these young Asian American artists and writers and musicians. Really feel a part of something that I think that everybody wanted to believe, we were building from the ground up. But the reason why I gravitated to Chinatown was because I grew up in post-war New York. I was born and raised in New York City. My parents met and married in New York. And I grew up at a time when the Japanese Americans were just beginning to resettle. They've been scattered across the country intentionally, to destroy the Japanese American communities that existed on the West Coast and disperse everybody. So my parents, I think, were equally traumatized by that experience. My father swore up and down. He was born in Sacramento. He would never go back to California. He never forgave the government for what happened, even though he was drafted very early on. He was in his first year at UCLA and got drafted into the Army, and a year later, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and his parents were sent to Tule Lake and later to Topaz as part of the relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war. So when he was coming out of, he was sent to Germany when the war ended and he landed in New York. I think his first instinct was to not return, so as a result, I grew up, I'm an only child without any connection to my extended family. I think that I was always looking for community as a result, always trying to find a place for myself. My parents are their parents were both from the same part of Japan, Kyushu, that sent so many workers to Hawaii to work on the sugar plantations. So my mother was one of 5 children that were born to farmers. I come from a long line of coffee farmers, landscapers, restaurant workers, migrant workers, and I think that my mother was fortunate to be one of the very few people in her family, the first to go to college. So, and she would not have been able to do that if she hadn't been a maid in Pearl Harbor about the time that there were lots of rumors that the Japanese were going to bomb Hawaii, and the naval family she worked with offered to bring her with them back to the US and mainland. And she wound up in Connecticut. I suppose at that time very generously offered to send her to school because she was confined during the war to a 2-mile radius of, within the Connecticut home she was living in. So I feel like the roots of my family began the same place, but then it largely because of the wartime experiences that they had, very different, but equally as challenging and difficult. I brought them to New York and to the East Coast, where it was that I grew up. There weren't that many Japanese Americans growing up in New York. I didn't have a lot of people my age, just a handful. Funny, we all remain very close as friends to this day. But it was in Chinatown really that I think that I fixed, like my sort of hopes and dreams on, because it felt like a community. And even though I was an outsider, I found a way to, I think, feel or find something that I belong to. My husband, I'm very grateful to him for grounding me in community and history. He had a large family, something that I didn't really understand until I married him, what it meant to have brothers and sisters, family and obligation, lots and lots of tradition that you had to honor. But he also was very interested in Asian American history at a time when very few people were talking about it, writing about it, or researching it. And taught the first Asian American history course at City College. Hunter. He took over actually from Fei Chang, who was director of the shop. She gave him the job. And he later was involved in hiring Jack Chen to take his place when he left. But it was his interest in Asian American history that got me interested in trying to understand the connection between art and memory and history, and how I could use art as a way to find the connection and reconstruct new stories that I felt were so important to share, to put into the world, because at that time there were so few ways that we could see ourselves mirrored in the world.
This is, I feel like each time we speak, there's something new that I always learn about you. And so I had no idea about your mom being in Connecticut, and also the connection with Megan and City College. Would love to see that syllabus if he has it stored somewhere, archived at home. I think in one of our, so just backtracking a little, in one of our earlier conversations, you mentioned that your family had settled in Harlem, right? Because it was one of the only neighborhoods that allowed Japanese Americans to settle after the war and incarceration. Um, what was it like growing up in Harlem for you at the time?
I've um, had a long history in this neighborhood that I live in, which is, I now live on the Upper West Side, but my parents moved to various places, sort of a few blocks from each other over the course of my growing up. And when they first settled in Harlem, um, they had this huge, well, I'm sure it wasn't that big, but I remember it is big, um, furnished apartment on 135th Street. And it was not long after they moved, and I realized it was because they had to move that my grandparents and my uncle, who had just been released from the internment camp, came to join us, and not and soon after that, my father's brother and his wife. So there were almost 11 of us in this apartment.
Mhm.
And it was cramped, but I think it was sort of a temporary arrangement, and for about 1 or 2 years, my grandparents took care of me when my mother went to work, and they only spoke Japanese. So I must have spoken Japanese at some point, but I quickly lost that language. I know it's here somewhere in
Mhm.
my heart. And growing up, I found that it wasn't unusual to to be the only Asian American or the Asian in the classroom. Um, and growing up mostly with African American, at that time, a very large Puerto Rican community on the Upper West Side. I think that I just learned very early to be prepared to tell my story. To talk about where I came from, and to, I guess, to understand, that I was really there, and in a way as a guest. I felt always like I was um, kind of privileged to be in these spaces, but at the same time, always learning. Like where I fit. So I guess that was a good way to think about how we all embed storytelling in our lives. And I think being in the city and growing up in an urban environment, I just was always ready to encounter people with very different stories from myself, very different life experiences. And I think that was, um, yeah, that was character building in a way. I think it was hard, and I attribute this to the fact that the U.S. has been in one long succession of wars in Asia, growing up in poor and working class communities that had to bear the burden of sending so many
Mhm.
of their young people to war. That growing up in post-war New York, in at the very beginning of the Korean War, and then later the Vietnam War, that there would always be this this anger, I think, and tension and need, I think, to navigate what the impact of those wars have had. You see that today. Now, it's new to me that there is all this anti-Asian violence and this need to find people to blame, for the conditions that are burdening Americans and people across the world. So it was not hard for me to suddenly find myself as a teenager looking at images of the Vietnam War and realizing, that people were not making any distinction between who was Japanese, who was Chinese, who was Vietnamese. We were all in the same boat, and we really needed to, I think, support some of these national liberation struggles around the world, as well as see the connection, the direct connection between the racism you were experiencing and what was happening overseas. I don't know if I answered your question. That was pretty abstract. I do feel like I grew up in New York. I love New York. I just, as hard as it is to live here, I've always lived here. So I feel like I'm one of those New Yorkers that actually take pride in the fact that I've toughed it out. And I remember, even worse times, when people talk about how scary it is now, and certainly being older, I see how the ways in which violence has been targeted at elderly Asians is, I find it so dismaying and troubling. But I'm one of those New Yorkers who always say, yeah, but it was a lot worse in the 70s. I remember, when this is not new. So I think that growing up in Harlem and feeling that I was part of one of these really fabled communities in New York probably was one of the reasons why I began to look around. One of these people who have lived and sort of stationed myself in one neighborhood in New York, I've seen so many changes happening in the community. And when I went to Chinatown, I could see that the very same things were happening in Chinatown as well. It's very disturbing.
I think what you said earlier really resonates, that we learn to tell our stories much earlier than we think, and how so much of it is just through everyday practice and making these connections that seem to have been so critical for you growing up, right? Making connections between Harlem and Chinatown, but also between the fact that struggles between Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese Americans are all connected and are transnational, global. I feel like that's also the ethos of the kind of activism work that we were talking earlier, Yuri embodied. And I'm curious to hear whether or not, I know that you've crossed paths with Yuri Kochiyama in Harlem. Do you remember what your first encounter was like with her, and how has she impacted your life as a mentor to so many young folks?
That's a great question. I remember it might have been Henry Chang, but somebody talking about Chinatown as being, it was like a village before the 60s. It was a small town. And I feel like I can say the same thing about the Japanese American community in New York City. that
Mhm.
it felt like we all knew each other, that the children of the families that moved here grew up together. And I think because of, and now I know, these patterns of discrimination, which in many ways only allowed Japanese to settle in certain areas of the city. We went to school together because we all lived in the same area. And so I went to school with a lot of the children, Yuri Kochiyama's children. Um, I later shared an apartment with her daughter. My daughter married her grandson. So I feel like our paths have crossed in so many different ways, and we continue to be
Mhm.
so close. But even more than that, for those of us who are still around, we remember that the Kochiyamas used to send out this newsletter called Christmas Cheer. And at the banner of the newsletter were little portraits of all the Kochiyamas and the children. And then it would be filled with all the news of the family and what they were doing. And each of the children wrote something in the newsletter. And back in those days, a lot of those newsletters were mimeographed. I think that Bill Kochiyama he was a graphic artist, and a lot of the children Kochiyamas were very talented artistically. And so he used to do the layout, and I remember Yuri used to take all the photographs, and she later went on to take so many photographs of demonstrations, events. She was like our documentarian. But I began, as I read these, and I was always so envious because I didn't have brothers and sisters, so I'd look at this large family uh, and all the things that they did together. I wished so much that I could have had that closeness, but I began to see how the stories began to change from things that they did together in the community to things that they were doing to really protest and struggle and fight for civil rights. And so there were very early stories about the family going to Mississippi to go on demonstrations and that Black Panther rallies, and the newsletter itself became a document of the family's activism. And I think that I remember having discussions with my parents about these newsletters because it was hard for a lot of the more conservative people in the community to really understand what, not only what the Kochiyama stood for, but also what it meant to really model a different kind of family. And I felt that Kochiyamas not only encouraged, the children to become activists or to go out of their way really to help each other and support other movements. But the household itself, the space that it occupied in Harlem became a space where people actually met each other, discussed events that were happening in the community, invited and welcomed, no matter where they came from or how, what worldview that they might have held at the moment, just to come and learn from each other. So I always thought it was, it was social, but it was always a very kind of provocative, challenging space of learning. And because I always learned something when I went there. I remember the apartment was in the projects. It was a very small space by many standards. It was always packed with people when I walked in the door, but the walls of the apartment were lined with posters, and they were there were posters that were made about Asian American struggles of Asian American communities by Asian American artists, and so I always felt like there was so much history there. And I think that Yuri was later on in life, and also after her passing, always seen as a connector, um, and also somebody who felt it was important to bear witness and document what was happening. So her apartment was filled with letters and files and documents and leaflets and posters and everything you can imagine. And it, you know, I'm very pleased to hear that her archives have been donated to the Labor Library of the University, so they are accessible to people who are interested in researching life.
I've always wondered, you know, what would it feel like? What would it look like? What would it sound like? Even smell like in Yuri's apartment? But I feel like you captured that so well, Tamia. And I'm just putting this out there, maybe like manifesting it. If you ever started a newsletter, I would absolutely subscribe to it.
Well, you know, because of the, this seems to be a real interest in risograph or risograph printing. And I first heard about this printing process when I was sitting on a panel, and there were all these proposals coming from Central and South America. And they were coming from communities that didn't have a lot of technology, but they did have a risograph press. And I was so interested in this process. And I do see that there's a huge movement in zine production, and just going back to some of the analog technology, where we begin with acknowledging that not everybody has digital access. You know, not everybody is wired and connected. What other ways can we reach people? But, you know,
I mean,
the idea of I have to laugh because I'm also a member of Godzilla, Asian American Art Network, and very recently we were brought together after 20 years, really, although many of us had maintained friendships through our being part of Godzilla in the 1990s. It wasn't until we were brought together by the Museum of Chinese Americans for a show that we caught up. You know, we were able to sort of look back at the history of the organization that it was, and it was largely through the efforts of Howie Chen, who wrote this amazing book, or put together. Created this amazing publication about the history of Godzilla Asian Art Network that we actually saw laid out, you know, all the different ways that people were connected and involved in Asian American art and Asian American communities. And I do have to add that, you know, we were at that time very excited about producing an exhibition about that history, but because of events that led to the Museum of Chinese America being complicit in the construction of a jail not too far from the museum, and the rolling out of a citywide jail plan that we, many of us in Godzilla, decided that we did not want to participate until the museum really came, I think, was open to the idea of explaining their decision and really having an open dialogue with the community about what it meant to accept money that was connected to the construction of jails, and how that kind of city funding, which is so tied to, I mean, why? I guess the main question is, why is cultural funding connected to the construction of prisons and jails? What that can do to destabilize a community, and it has totally destabilized all the relationships in Chinatown. And I'd be happy to talk about this more, but the reason why I brought this up was because there were, during the course of our trying to understand what was happening at MoCA and what was happening in the city at the time, a flurry of emails. And it caused me to remember that back in the day, members of Godzilla communicated with a mailing list. we sent postcards to each other in the mail, and I was in fact in charge of the phone tree. So we had about 200 members, and somehow we divided up this membership so that we were responsible for calling 10 people and they were responsible for calling 10 other people. But news traveled so slowly. And one of the things that is in this book that Howie put together are the newsletters that Godzilla published over the course of its rather short life, but the newsletter contained articles and sort of debates about what is ancient American art, and even different positions that people were holding around the Gulf War or things that were occurring in the world. But at the back of the newsletter were all these listings of galleries, shows, and exhibitions that Asian American artists were holding. And those were targeted and directed towards curators who claimed they didn't know that there were Asian American artists making work. But it would take many months for those newsletters to reach anyone. So they weren't exactly helpful in terms of telling people what to see or where to go. But eventually became, and we weren't even thinking about that, an archive of all the membership and the work that we were doing together. And I honestly think that we thought we were spreading the news, but in retrospect, we were holding the news. We were in many ways archiving, collecting, and preserving that news for the future. And I think that is one of the reasons why newsletters and just even ways to record, and certainly there's a lot of amazing video and photography out there, record and document what we are doing. It really seems like a new role for artists and even activists who can use these cultural tools to advocate and protect and preserve the history of our activism that it seems to disappear into the ether. We don't seem to know what happened before us.
Yeah, I think that many artists probably don't think about archiving as much as you do, and perhaps it's because you've been part of so many different collectives in the past, right? Godzilla, Basement, the Art Brigade. And I'm finding now a lot of younger Asian Americans, so many of my students are interested in sort of like excavating these histories and trying to learn more about the past, right? So you mentioned Howie's recent book on Godzilla is an amazing resource. It's also like, I think it's over 1,000 pages. It's really, it's amazing how large it is. It's beautiful, yes. And but the issue is a lot of younger Asian Americans also don't necessarily know where to start, right? Um, with their artistic interest. And so I'd love to hear about what your path was to becoming an artist in New York City and also how your artistic work, I mean, was it always embedded in activism or did it take time for you to sort of make those connections more seamless?
No, I appreciate so much this discussion about activism, and wish there was a way to define it, maybe in different periods. I never really saw myself as an activist so much as somebody who was responding to events around me, and again, trying to make some meaning out of that. But I find today that when I speak to younger people, what they're so interested in is this question of how did you become an activist, or what was the moment, where you realized that this is what you wanted to do? And I think it's so hard to answer that because I, for one, didn't really even know what activist was or what that kind of commitment meant. I mean, I can't say that I didn't see so many different models for that around me. And growing up in the 70s, of course, you see so many groups, revolutionary groups, engaged in real liberation struggles, who were held up as models. And I don't know that I ever thought of myself in that same way, or even thought that I could aspire to that kind of life, that kind of commitment that you would have to make. So I think that my journey as an artist was just a series of small steps. I do feel like one sort of defining moment, if you could call it that, was the fact that because of the circumstances in my life, because I was a single mother when I was 19, and because I couldn't go to college, that really shaped the trajectory of everything that I was to do after that. And I feel like, there's a part of me that totally understands what it means to have no options, to be, forced to give up dreams, or, because of circumstances, and then try to find a way to get back. When people talk about, even when people are talking about the deplorables, and the uneducated working class people who voted for Trump, there was part of me that really understood that. I got it, because if you don't have this paper certificate that shows that you had a higher education, there are so many doors closed to you. Way back in the 90s and 80s, when people weren't even aware of the lack of racial diversity, on university campuses. I think that sense that you were marginalized because of class or economic situations, was something that made me realize that I had to find other alternatives. And I don't know if this is true at all, but I felt like the 60s and 70s were a time when people believed that you could build your own alternatives. You know, there were maybe because there was such an emphasis placed on the counterculture movement, maybe because we were looking at so many global and international struggles for liberation among peasants and people who were not educated or well upper class. Maybe it was because we were seeing all these militant sort of formations like the Panthers and the Young Lords who were looking at what was looking at the broken system that wasn't serving their community and saying, well, our children are hungry, we're just going to provide lunches for them. We're going to provide our own lunch programs. We're going to provide our own health services. We're going to educate our own children. I think that was a part of my sense, that it was a possibility, that, it was, yes, I didn't have a lot of these advantages, but I could turn around and I could see that there were so many other possibilities out there. And one of the, I guess I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, but there was money in New York for community arts programs. And when I was in my 20s, I thought that was a way that I could reclaim my dream of being an artist, that I could go into one of these programs and I could, as a participant, but also as somebody who could help shape, what community art could look like. And so I was able to I get my first job as an artist painting murals on the Lower East Side, which I did for 7 years. And that, and I often say that, that was my classroom. So when I graduated from murals, I felt like I had really deep resources that I could draw from, experiences working with. Not all of them were successful, certainly. It was challenging. And I think that we were all sort of like we are now, making the path we were walking on and trying to figure it out as we were doing it. But I feel like there were so many parallels that you could make from that period and today, where people are trying to create different models, trying to dismantle, what exists, and really commit to a kind of a messy process of creating something different and hopefully better, a way of a different and better way of relating to each other and trying to meet each other's needs. And I forgot what you asked me about. Was it about community? Was it?
It was just about, I think you answered it, just thinking about, a lot of my students are interested in artistic and cultural work, but don't really know where to get started. But I think from what you're saying, it's really looking around you and realizing that perhaps like the small steps that you're taking are already leading you towards that larger moment of realization that folks are hoping for. But it's really sort of the smaller steps that get you there that really matter, that shape how you come to terms with your role as an artist and the communities you want to be working with, right, as an artist. And I think you mentioned you worked on several murals in the Lower East Side and also Chinatown. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what you remember from those murals, if you remember at all? And, I know that murals are supposed to be transient, right? That when they come up, you don't really know what will happen. Um, and is there a way that you've been thinking about memorializing or preserving, commemorating the mural work that you've been doing in the past?
Um, yeah, I think that murals are a medium for communication. And
Mhm.
I think that artists across history have used murals, have used the canvas, the city, and even the cave, to paint
Mhm.
stories about, the people who live there, and the different, movements that need to be honored or memorialized. I never thought of the murals really as anything but um, opportunities for people to just celebrate that they were there, that this is who they were, what they stood for, and certainly, in the context of the city and how that landscape is constantly changing. We never thought that they would last forever. Um, but even more importantly for me, I think that in art school, and I did actually go to art school. You are um, taught to believe in your own innate skill and talent, and that you're encouraged to think of yourself as exceptional. And so it creates an enormously competitive atmosphere, because you are always trying to show that you are more creative than the person next to you. And it's not conducive to working together. And then, you find that, well, you can't be an architect or a film director or do anything in the arts unless you understand how to collaborate. And certainly murals were one simple example. How you can't make anything that big unless you work collectively, if you work with people. Um, and certainly you don't want to be the one who just delegates responsibility. You want to, I think if it were truly a reflection of the people who lived in the area, on the block, in the neighborhood you were painting a mural, you want them to be involved. And so I was really fortunate that the program that I work with believed that people, no matter whether they were artists or just people who lived in the building the mural was painted in, or were passing by, should be involved and have a say in art that they have to live with. They have to walk by every day. So um, my job in those days was to organize mural teams and to identify walls. The Lower East Side was a target for urban renewal, just like the South Bronx at the time. So what you would see on every block were abandoned buildings, or what they call party walls. These large empty walls where buildings had been torn down and left, this like beautiful, inviting canvas for muralists to paint on. And there were a lot of young people who, in the summertime, had nowhere, nothing to do, and so the murals were, a great space for bringing people together. And at that time, yes, there was what they call a CETA program, employment for young people. Not much, but it's money, um, employment for artists. There was community um, um, funding for projects that would would be initiated, serve like different areas of the city. So I guess I learned to navigate that, and also to be able to just, I think the sort of tightrope that people in nonprofits have to walk all the time, navigate the funding and the actual change that you want to see happen. Sometimes it's not aligned. So I think that those early projects were, I saw them as, experiments in a way, that just people were actually asked, not to think about these things as monumental works of art. Just how do we approach something like this in the spirit of of honoring each other and each other's voices, and understanding that it's not my job to design this piece, but to have everybody participate in it. And the murals that we did in Chinatown were actually all ways to kind of arrive at some kind of history, or honor the histories of the people who live there. So the mural that I was most fond of, that I felt was really the most successful in terms of engaging all the people in the group, and really putting out something I felt they were proud of, or that they felt it was something that they could bring families to, was the mural, the Wall of Respect for the Working People of Chinatown. And it featured portraits of members of the group who were acting out the different roles that their families played as garment workers, as construction workers, as waiters and servers, and people who labored in Chinatown. And so I don't know how you gauge the success of projects like these, because there's no one rule that says, this is what makes a project successful, but certainly feeling that over the years it had become a part of the history of Chinatown, a part of a space that people remembered. That was something that I thought, for me, made it a very special place of memory.
I listened to the interview that you had with the Bridging Futures, a few of the Bridging Futures member at WOW, and I remember that there was one part of the conversation that was so powerful that you shared about the Wall of Respect mural, and that one of the Chinatown Tenants organizers with CTU and CAB, Mr. Wong, mentioned that he would know that he's home by just looking at your mural, right? And that was just so powerful, and that sort of is a marker of home, right? It's an act of placekeeping, despite sort of the temporality of it, that it no longer exists, but that still meant something to him. Knowing that he was getting closer to home was so powerful. I know that we are at an hour. Maybe we can just do a temperature check. Tomie, how are you feeling?
I'm fine. I feel like memories are so selective, and so what I want to talk about are all those intimate moments, where I really feel like I had personal connection to the questions you're asking, and then I wind up talking about very general sort of events. And I think that when this interview is over, I'll remember all the things that I should have said. But I'm fine to go a little longer, but I know that we're okay.
Okay. Do you want to take a break? Maybe just like a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, just to grab water, since you've been talking for a while and it's hot.
No, okay. Let's go a few more
Are you sure?
Yeah. I think that maybe I can try to remember some of the things I do want to say.
Yeah, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to? So I was going to ask about the different collectives, because I think that was one of the questions that Nancy was interested in. And then just how you're thinking about, the future, and another thing about what you've learned from younger Asian American activists and artists today,
That's a good
and what you hope to impart.
I think it's a good set of questions to land on.
Okay.
To wrap this up, I mean, I do feel like the story you told me about Mr. Wong reminds me is so moving and touching for so many reasons. But I think that having art that's embedded in the community, either a wayfaring sign or just a symbol, of a neighborhood, is really important to me. I do a lot of public art, or I try to make a living doing public art, and I think that part of that, the work that I do in public spaces, which really looks to trying to honor the places in which the art exists, is part of a larger movement, of people who are trying to activate public space, trying to access and have some authority over, what places need to be preserved, protected, honored, and included in that is, looking at the ways in which our histories are written and are assigned value, like which histories are assigned value in this country. And you can just take a look at all the monuments, see what this country honors, and how many monuments are devoted to war, memorials, and how few are devoted to people who have actually contributed and built the spaces we live in. So I think that there is and this is a particularly exciting time to be an artist and to think about all the multiple ways that artists can engage differently than what we were perhaps trained to think of as art and culture as we were growing up on art school. So it's so exciting to I think be in this moment, think about what it means to imagine at a time like this, and how artists, are supposed to be good at that, but we're not the only ones. It has to be done in collaboration and in connection with everybody who would be most impacted by what's happening today. And I know that young people are always interested in that moment when maybe I decided to become an activist or become a community artist. I'm equally excited and interested in knowing what is it that moves people to embrace a more radical view of the world. What moment is it that inspires somebody to make a change in it, or to refuse? I think this act of refusal, is not a negative act, but it's really a way of looking at how do we stop doing the same thing that doesn't work? How do we really look at all the various ways we're complicit, cementing or holding up, these very things that we want to change. And I feel like one of the things that I think happened during COVID and during that moment, the anthropause slowed down, was that we were able to take a long, hard look around us, and that this is a moment we can't squander. We really have to use this moment now to rebuild and to have some confidence, or to really to drop our cynicism and our despair, and really believe that we can dream, we can reimagine things, and it doesn't have to be the same as what it was before. I feel that way very deeply about the movement and activism. We can't rely on ways we engage with people in the past. There are a lot of lessons we can learn. There are still people like me, who are banging around that you can talk to about that time. But and so many great scholars and historians are researching all that history and activism and documented it. But it's up to us to really move forward and imagine futures and take the risks, I think, that you have to do something different. It's very hard to work with people. You know that, and there's a lot you have to give up in terms of your own ego or your own sense of control. But at the same time, it brings you somewhere very differently than what you thought or could have been yourself.
Yeah, I think what's so powerful about your work is that, yes, you spend time in your studio, but so much of it is collective, right? It's in community, it's in conversation through struggle. And I'm always curious about what your time was like in the different collectives that were involved with. So Godzilla, Basement, and also the Brigade, right? And what kind of differences do you see with your involvement in each of them? Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Well, I remember that first sense of awe that I had when we finished painting the mural. We took the scaffolding down and we all stepped back and we went, wow, we did this. We finished. This is something we accomplished. And I do feel like I get that same sense whenever I work collectively, that there are moments when I can step back and say, like the first projection that we did in Chinatown, we got to see these messages projected on 5-story buildings, and we're like, oh my God, we made this happen. It's so exciting and empowering. You almost forget, how much work went in to that process that enabled you to get to that point. But clearly, every time you do something like that, the next time you do it is a lot easier, or you feel like you have something to draw from. When I worked at Basement, it was really this sense of this being in a space where there were so many voices, so many different voices that kind of made me draw back and kind of awe, because I had never heard these stories before. So, you know, of course, creating these spaces where there's not just one story, but so many, and realize that this is actually a public space. You know, this is a community space. It's not just a space that excludes. It's not a club that excludes so many other stories. It's something that's inclusive. That to me is also something, a moment where you realize that you can create these spaces where everyone belongs and not necessarily drown out each other. Godzilla was the same. You know, I felt like at that time we were trying to make a difference in the art world. We're just trying to point out, you know, that there are glaring omissions and absences and misinformation and just a general lack of respect, you know, for so many people of color and so many artists of color, and that things have to change. That was a moment where I felt like so much respect, you know, for the people who were so seriously working in their lives as educators, as historians, to add their histories and stories to the record, the official record, because that is so important. You know, and also at the same time questioning, like, who has a right, you know, to hold these assigned value, designate it as official record. And later, you know, I think working with the brigade and working with WOW and other feminist formations, I feel like I see a sea change in the ways in which power is being redistributed, and how leadership is being built now. And you know, just a genuine respect for the time and care that we need to build that kind of leadership. Not to say that, you know, I think that there are life cycles to groups and organizations, you know, that they need a need. They shouldn't last forever, because those needs change, conditions change. And when some of these conditions are outside of our communities, we don't have a lot of control over them, but I do feel like building this community power, which is something I'm learning now as a new staff person at CAD, as a new artist in residence, is a process that does take time.
There's so much that I want to say in response, but one of the things that you know, I've been thinking about from what you shared about your involvement in different collectives, and for me, what I've seen as sort of a defining difference between the earlier collectives, right, and more contemporary collectives like the Brigade and WOW is that so much of the work now is being led by femme, queer, trans, non-binary folks, right? Those who are gender expansive youth. And that is so powerful to me. And I think that is something that, you know, when I think of Asian American futures, I hope will continue. But I'm really curious to hear, you know, what are your hopes for the future, and what do you see your role in when it comes to shaping the future, right?
I remember that when I first met with the Bridging Futures group, they asked me, if you were to write a letter to your future self, what would you say? And I had to say, it made me laugh because in a way I am my future self. I mean, I feel like there's a big difference between being young and thinking about the future and being my age and thinking about the future. Not that I feel like it's all, looking back necessarily, and trying to make sense of the present and then moving forward. But I do feel like my role is pretty insignificant at this point. I think that, as you said, there are these amazing new formations being built of people of color, of femme, trans, queer, activists who are looking at, and I think in a very loving way, all the sort of patriarchal, kinds of relationships that they have in their families and in their communities, and trying to transform that. And I think maybe within that, I guess that process of questioning and challenging these harmful traditions and ways that we could reinvent ourselves to be more productive and supportive. There is a need for these intergenerational spaces where I can have conversations with you and have some genuine, substantive conversations with younger people. I think that that's something that I would always support and want to help build, because I do see that I see so many of my friends passing away, and so much of that history disappearing, and I always feel like there is something to be gained from learning from each other's experiences. At the same time, I do feel like that's only one part, of how people create and shape identities for themselves. And even when it comes to Asian American art, I feel like that's a very fluid term. It meant one thing in the 60s, and another thing in the 90s. And now we're looking at even the term Asian American, trying to understand whether that's accurate enough, whether it's inclusive enough, whether it even makes sense to retain the American part of it, in light of the way this country is just denied so much, in terms of human rights to its citizens. I don't know, I'd want to be a part of that conversation, that discussion, just encourage people, generation, to feel that they can participate, but also, that we need to change the way we see the world too. One-way process. I'm most encouraged by the fact that people and artists, the art world is changing. This happened in my lifetime. That I can actually see that some of the ways in which the art world has existed for centuries, as this just elitist enclaves for people who hold power, can be dismantled. I mean, if that were possible in my lifetime, which I see the cracks, I would want to be there.
I mean, this is a question that I've been thinking about for a while. And I think our work with the brigade has really spurred my thinking about like what is Asian American art? Is there a defining feature? Is there a thread that binds? Is there like a particular aesthetic? I think, but more importantly, what does it mean to be an Asian American artist in our current moment that's so fractured, that's filled with so much uncertainty? And I'd love to hear from you, maybe what does it mean for you to be an Asian American artist right now in our current moment?
I'm one of the things that I'm very inspired by at this moment is the whole um, idea of Afrofuturism. I,
Mm.
I think that Asian Americans have always had inspiration in African American civil rights struggles and in African American culture. But this notion that you can look at the future and create these stories of liberation through the lens of being an African American, to me is a model of how I could, as an Asian American, see the world through
Mm.
my lens. Understanding that that's not the only lens out there, but that I can bring that perspective uh, to the world in a way that adds to a greater understanding of how we can relate as people, as communities. I feel like, and I often quote this, but this idea that Karen um, Ishizuka from the Japanese American National Museum had put out, that the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, the questioning of their loyalty and their dislocation and displacement, is a foundational narrative for Japanese.
Mm.
It's a trauma that people return to again. And I see the through line between the displacement and incarceration of my relatives. Excuse me. Sorry.
Take your time, Tamia.
Just when I had something interesting to say. Sorry. Anyway, I see the through line between my family's incarceration and their displacement, losing everything they had and having to restart their lives again after the war, as one of the reasons why I think I'm so interested in issues of displacement and gentrification now. So I've certainly carried this trauma with me. And I feel for many Asians in America who share migration stories. And for many of them, just getting to America was a foundational narrative that they feel it necessary now to disclose or to share. And the extent of discrimination that they felt in those early years of resettling, I think those are foundational narratives as well. And I've seen those narratives expressed and revisited many times in Asian American art. And for many of us, that has defined how we see what Asian American art is. And I think perhaps now that we're in a position to really think more about the impact of that trauma and how it's, in many ways, a shared history that we can hopefully move on to new narratives, new visions for the future, that our work can embody that. But it is so difficult because of all the different countries that we come from and all our different experiences, languages, cultures, to find one defining aesthetic or characteristic of Asian American art, then maybe we should just give up. Maybe we are just not at this point in time able to find the common denominator, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe unlike, I also don't want to. In essence, do the same thing to African American artists, but there is a defining, I think, African American art, and certainly African American music that I don't know that we can find the equivalent in Asian American art, music, and culture. But maybe there is such a thing as a racially or ethnically defined art form that's unique to this country, to this experience that we share as Americans. I just feel that maybe it's not helpful to always try to find that common denominator, but to be willing to accept the fact that we are all trying to build something different and new, and that's the only thing that we share in common.
That was beautiful. I think that's something that really resonates with me in thinking about, when folks ask, what do you imagine when you think of Asian American futures? I think the tendency is to think about, there's a tendency to think about Asian American in terms of demographics, right? Asian Americans are going to be the majority minority. And that to me is incredibly passive, right? And I think for me, the future is not as far as we think, right? There are things that are taking place and unfolding within communities like Chinatown, like the WOW Project and the Art Brigade, where it is queer, trans, non-binary, gender expansive folks who are expanding how we think about the familial and the fraternal, right? And thinking about abolitionist and feminist futures in a way that I think folks really haven't been thinking about in the past. That's so powerful. And so, yeah, sitting with the idea that Asian America is more than demographics, is more than something that's assigned to you, right? Something that it's something that you have to grow into. Is something that, I'm hearing from you and that I hope to hold as we think about, what the future will look like, because I don't think that the future is as far as we think it is. The other thing I wanted to ask, or to perhaps close on, is, we've known each other for almost 7 years now, which to me is incredible, right? Because I never really thought of our relationship in terms of like temporally like that, especially with the memory project that we've been working in, where we almost saw each other every week. But I've really come to see you as someone I deeply love, as a mentor. And something that I really love about you is sort of your curiosity and your openness to learn across generations, especially from those who are younger, right? So you making, I know that the Art Brigade receives a lot of emails from students, requesting interviews, and you're always one of the first to respond, to be in conversation with younger folks, with students, with those who are also curious. And so one of the things I'm really curious to hear from you is, what is something that you've learned from being in conversation with younger folks?
It's hard to find just one thing. I feel like, the older you get, the more out of touch you get. I never turn down a request from a student, just to be in conversation, because I feel like it's such an opportunity, to understand, how they see the world, but also what is going on in the world, in a way that I can't, from the the sort of station that I'm looking at it from. But I think that I guess that I appreciate that young people have so many questions, and so that is how I think I need to remind myself how generative and important that is, and that having answers is not necessarily a good thing, because you get stuck in thinking that one size fits all, or that it's a bit arrogant, actually, to think that you have answers to a lot of things. So retaining, as you said, that curiosity, that doubt, those questions, that has to be something that moves people, because otherwise you'd be satisfied to stay where you are in your bubble, safe, having questions, always thinking about challenging what you've heard. This active refusal, which is not, again, not saying no. It's just saying, I don't know that I want to be part of this, because I see something in it that troubles me, that I don't understand. I think that young people are so honest about that. As you get older, it gets harder to ask questions, because then you feel insecure. You feel like, oh, I'm supposed to know the answers to it. But also, I feel like personally, I always feel like I'm playing catch up. Like I'm trying so hard, to understand the language that people communicate in, and just the inflections, in their language, the nuance. Every time I meet somebody, and it's just something that I feel. I know it sounds weird, but it makes me a better artist, because I think that I don't just trust what I see. I have to talk to people, and I have to hear from them. I have to listen to them. I have to be able to empathize. That's what art is. It's empathy. It's being able to put somebody else in your place, and vice versa, to understand how other people are looking at the world. So, plus, I think that young people have new ideas. And how important is that? That's, and thinking, part of that is thinking you have new ideas, and so it's very hard to get discouraged or inflated, or deflated, because you think, oh, I thought this was a new idea, but it isn't, because it was done before. But still, that's a process, and I don't know how many people my age think that they're bringing something new into the world. So that's why I think it's just so important to listen to younger people.
What advice do you have for younger folks out there who are tuning in?
I don't know that did I have any advice really that would resonate other than that I've learned to have a certain amount of humility. You know, that I think that I had to learn that over age, you know, over 10 years. That I think that almost anything that an older person can tell a younger person has to do with not giving up, you know, looking at the future before you, and that's all fine and good. But you know, the being in the moment, you know, and practicing humility, that's the best you can do. But also, you know, I feel like this has been a very hard time, the time that we just spent during the pandemic. It was so isolating and so frightening in many ways, in terms of thinking. You can't even think about the future now because it feels so precarious. So I feel like this isn't something I ever experienced as a young person. I can't imagine what it was. It was like to go through COVID as somebody who's young, trying to go to school, trying to connect with people that they were isolated from. So I feel like I am very much in awe of this next generation, looking at how they
Well, that's such a beautiful way to close out. Thank you, Tomie, for this conversation. This is something I'm going to be thinking about for a while. Just really appreciate you always. This is going to be part one of a two-part conversation. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan.